My name is Susan, and I am 65 years old. My life's work as a research scientist, spanning 4 decades of meticulous planning and disciplined saving, culminated in substantial retirement savings that I had carefully built for my golden years. But when my daughter Clara approached me with her dream of creating a revolutionary tech startup, I saw something bigger than my own comfort. I poured every penny, every hour of my hard-earned expertise into building her vision from concept to market reality. I became an unpaid advisor, a co-creator, sacrificing my comfortable retirement to nurture what I believed was a continuation of my own life's work, a legacy we would share together. Then, at what should have been our moment of triumph, a crucial press conference to announce our company's breakthrough success, Clara delivered a blow that stole my breath and shattered my world. With chilling detachment, she publicly introduced me not as her partner and co-creator, but as a temporary consultant, presenting fabricated agreements that erased my contributions entirely. When I protested in shocked disbelief, she and her ruthless husband, Greg, coldly stated, "Mom, you were never a partner. Your services were compensated." They offered me a meager severance package while threatening swift legal action if I dared to challenge their version of reality. Yet as their lawyer threatened defamation suits and my own grandson Michael began calling me Ms. Susan instead of Grandma, something awakened within me. My scientist's rigorous discipline ignited a cold fury. What Clara, Greg, and their lawyer didn't know were my secrets, detailed scientific notebooks documenting every hour of work, every strategic plan, every financial contribution I had made. Most importantly, I possessed crucial audio recordings of Clara explicitly acknowledging me as her founding partner. This time, their insidious fraud wouldn't just unravel, it would expose their ruthless betrayal and restore both my rightful ownership and my peace of mind. The glass towers of downtown had never felt so cold as I walked through the lobby of what had once been our shared dream, now transformed into Clara and Greg's corporate empire. The receptionist, a young woman I had helped train in our early days, looked at me with polite confusion when I asked to see Clara. "Do you have an appointment, ma'am?" she asked clearly, not recognizing the woman who had spent countless evenings in this very building, working side by side with her daughter to build something meaningful. Clara's corner office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furnishings, felt like a shrine to everything we had once stood against. I remembered when we used to joke about corporate excess, when we promised each other that success would never change our values or our relationship. Now Clara sat behind a mahogany desk that probably cost more than most people's cars, while Greg lounged in a leather chair with the satisfied smirk of someone who had gotten away with something. "Mom," Clara said, without standing her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone conducting an unpleasant business meeting. "I was wondering when you'd want to discuss this properly. Mr. Roberts is here to help us work through any misunderstandings." Mr. Roberts, their attorney, was a man in his 50s with the kind of polished appearance that screamed expensive legal fees. He had arranged a stack of documents on the conference table like weapons in an armory, each one designed to cut away another piece of my dignity. "Susan," Greg said, leaning back in his chair with that condescending smile I had grown to despise. "Let's be honest here. You're a brilliant scientist, but you were always a little naive about how things work outside your laboratory. This is business, not a family science project." The words stung because they carried just enough truth to be devastating. I had been naive. I had believed that family meant something, that the sacrifices I made for my daughter would be honored and remembered. I had trusted that the late nights we spent together planning and dreaming and building had created bonds that couldn't be broken by greed or ambition. "Clara," I said, my voice barely steady, "this wasn't just a business deal for me. This was our dream, our future together. I didn't just invest my money. I invested my life, my expertise, my retirement security. Don't you remember our late nights in the lab, working through problems together? Don't you remember how we used to talk about changing the world through ethical science?" For just a moment, I saw something flicker in Clara's eyes, a shadow of the daughter I had raised, the young woman who had once shared my passion for discovery and integrity. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "Mom, you need to understand something," Clara said, her voice taking on the patient tone someone might use with a confused elderly person. "You were never a partner in this company. You were an investor, yes, and a diligent employee. But this is a big business now. There's no room for sentimentality or misunderstandings about roles and responsibilities." Greg nodded approvingly at his wife's performance. "Your services were always compensated fairly, Susan. We've been more than generous, actually. Most consulting relationships don't last as long as ours did." Mr. Roberts slid a document across the table toward me. "This is a comprehensive severance package," he said in a tone that suggested he was doing me an enormous favor. "It includes payment for your consulting services through last month, plus a generous bonus for your years of dedication. All we need is your signature acknowledging that your consulting relationship with the company has concluded." I stared at the document, my trained eye immediately recognizing the legal language designed to strip away every claim I might have to the company I had helped build. The severance amount was laughably small, less than I had invested in the company's first month of operation. "This is insulting," I whispered, my voice carrying decades of suppressed anger. "I put my entire retirement savings into this company. I mortgaged my house to fund your expansion. I gave you 4 years of my life working without salary because I believed we were building something together." Mr. Roberts' expression didn't change. "Ms. Davis, I need to advise you that any claims about partnership or ownership that aren't documented in our corporate records could be construed as fraudulent. If you choose not to accept this generous severance offer, the company will be forced to pursue legal remedies to protect its interests." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. They weren't just stealing my contributions, they were threatening to criminalize my very existence, to paint me as a delusional old woman trying to defraud her own daughter's company. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. Michael, my grandson, appeared in the doorway of the conference room. At 15, he had grown tall and handsome with Clara's quick intelligence, and I had hoped some trace of my integrity. But the boy who had once spent weekends in my laboratory, wide-eyed with wonder at the mysteries of science, now looked at me with polite distance. "Ms. Susan," he said, using the formal address that felt like a knife to my heart, "Mom and Dad explained what's happening. I'm sorry you're upset about the business stuff, but you can't try to take what they've worked so hard to build." The words came from my grandson's mouth, but I heard Greg's manipulation behind them. This child whom I had loved and nurtured and taught about the wonders of discovery had been turned into another weapon against me. "Michael," I said softly, reaching toward him with a grandmother's instinctive gesture of love. "You know me better than this. You know I would never try to hurt your parents or take anything that wasn't rightfully mine." But Michael stepped back, his expression uncertain but resolute. "I know you're a good person, Ms. Susan, but Mom says you're confused about business things. Maybe you should just take the money and enjoy your retirement." The corporate office, with its expensive furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows, suddenly felt like a courtroom where I was both defendant and victim. My own family had become the prosecution, presenting evidence of my supposed delusions while offering a plea bargain that would erase my existence from the company I had helped create. "I need time to think about this," I said, standing on legs that felt unsteady. Greg's smile was all sharp edges. "Don't take too long, Susan. Generous offers have a way of becoming less generous over time." As I walked toward the elevator, I heard Mr. Roberts speaking quietly to Clara. "She'll come around. She doesn't really have any other choice. The documentation is clear, and without concrete proof of partnership, she's just another disgruntled ex-employee." The elevator doors closed on the sound of their confident laughter, sealing me away from the world I had helped create. In that moment, descending through the floors of the building where I had once belonged, I realized that my greatest mistake hadn't been trusting my daughter with my money or my expertise. My greatest mistake had been believing that love and sacrifice were enough to protect me from the kind of people my daughter and her husband had chosen to become. The betrayal deepened with each passing day, like a wound that refused to heal. Within a week of our confrontation, Clara and Greg announced their bold new vision for the company, a massive international expansion, funded by aggressive borrowing and venture capital investments that went against every principle of cautious growth I had taught them. The press release, which I read online like any other outsider, painted their strategy as innovative leadership, moving beyond traditional scientific caution. The word stung because I recognized my own conservative approach being dismissed as weakness, my decades of hard-won experience reduced to outdated thinking that was holding back progress. But what truly horrified me was the financial structure of their expansion. Through contacts I still maintained in the industry, former colleagues who remembered when ethics mattered more than profit margins, I received copies of internal documents that revealed the true scope of Clara and Greg's corruption. The international expansion wasn't just risky, it was built on a foundation of shell corporations and creative accounting that diverted funds through entities controlled entirely by Greg. Money that should have been invested in research and development was being funneled into personal accounts, luxury purchases, and speculative investments that had nothing to do with our original mission. Sarah Martinez, a junior researcher who had worked with me since the company's early days, called me late one evening with tears in her voice. "Dr. Davis," she whispered, clearly afraid of being overheard, "I can't stay silent anymore about what's happening here. They're not just changing the direction of the research, they're stealing the intellectual property you developed and registering it under their names." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean, Sarah?" "The breakthrough process you developed for molecular synthesis, the one you spent 2 years perfecting. They've filed new patents listing only Clara and Greg as inventors. They're erasing your contributions from the scientific record while profiting from your discoveries." The phone felt heavy in my trembling hands. Intellectual property theft was more than just business fraud. It was an attack on the very foundation of scientific integrity, the principle that discoveries belong to their true creators and that credit must be given where credit was due. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "They're planning to license your process to competitors for massive fees, but they're calling it the Morrison method, after Greg's maiden name. They're literally stealing your life's work and selling it as their own innovation." After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment, the modest place I had moved to after being forced to sell my house to cover the legal fees from their threats, and felt the weight of complete betrayal settle around me like a shroud. This wasn't just about money or recognition anymore. This was about the systematic erasure of my scientific legacy, the theft of discoveries that represented decades of careful research and innovation. But Sarah's revelation had awakened a memory I had buried so deeply that I had almost convinced myself it never happened. A memory that made Clara's current theft of my intellectual property not just cruel, but cosmically ironic. 25 years ago, when Clara was a graduate student struggling to establish herself in the competitive world of molecular biology, she had faced a crisis that threatened to end her academic career before it began. Her thesis advisor had discovered that significant portions of her foundational research paper contained plagiarized material data and conclusions lifted from obscure European studies that she thought no one would recognize. The plagiarism scandal would have destroyed Clara's future in science, marking her permanently as someone who couldn't be trusted with original research. She came to me in tears, confessing her mistake and begging for help, not money or influence, but intellectual salvation. What I did next went against every ethical principle I had been trained to uphold as a scientist. I spent 6 months secretly rewriting Clara's entire thesis, replacing the plagiarized sections with original research that I conducted in my own laboratory. I used my expertise and my resources to create genuine discoveries that would support Clara's conclusions, then helped her destroy all evidence of the original plagiarized work. Clara never knew the full extent of what I had done. She thought I had simply helped her revise and improve her research methodology, but I had essentially rebuilt her entire academic foundation from the ground up, sacrificing my own potential publications and discoveries to save her career. The irony was devastating. I had once compromised my own scientific integrity to protect Clara's reputation, and now she was repaying that sacrifice by stealing my legitimate discoveries and claiming them as her own innovations. The next morning brought an even more painful revelation. I was reading industry news online when I came across an interview with Clara in a prominent science magazine. The headline read, "Young Innovator Modernizes Outdated Research Methods." In the interview, Clara spoke dismissively about traditional approaches that were holding back scientific progress. She specifically criticized researchers who were too cautious to embrace bold new methodologies, clearly referring to me without naming me directly. Some people in this field, Clara was quoted as saying, are so invested in outdated ethical frameworks that they can't see the opportunities that come with strategic risk-taking. They mistake innovation for recklessness and call progress dangerous. The words were carefully chosen to sound thoughtful and forward-thinking, but I recognized the attack on everything I had taught her about responsible research and ethical business practices. She was publicly positioning herself as the future of science while painting me as a relic of the past. Greg's quotes in the same article were even more pointed. We've had to move beyond some of the more conservative voices in our field. Innovation requires courage, and not everyone has the vision to see where the industry is heading. The article included a photo of Clara and Greg in their executive office, looking confident and successful, with no mention of the woman who had made their success possible. I had been erased from the narrative, entirely transformed from co-creator to cautionary tale. That afternoon, Mr. Roberts called with what he described as a final settlement offer. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone who believed he held all the cards. "Susan," he said, dispensing with even basic courtesy, "my clients are prepared to make one last generous offer. They'll provide a modest one-time payment for your past consulting services, but only if you sign a comprehensive non-compete agreement and a permanent non-disclosure agreement." The terms he outlined were designed to erase me from the industry entirely. The non-compete clause would prevent me from working in molecular biology for 5 years, effectively ending my career since I would be 70 by the time it expired. The non-disclosure agreement would legally silence me about any claims of partnership or ownership, making it criminal for me to tell the truth about my contributions to the company. This offer expires in 48 hours, Mr. Roberts continued. After that, my clients will be forced to pursue more aggressive legal remedies to protect their interests and their reputation. The threat was clear: accept their terms and disappear quietly, or face a legal battle that would drain my remaining resources and destroy what was left of my professional reputation. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Clara and Greg weren't just stealing my money and my discoveries, they were trying to steal my voice, my identity, and my right to exist as a scientist. They wanted to transform me from a respected researcher into a non-person, someone whose contributions could be safely ignored because she no longer had the legal right to speak about them. But they had made one crucial mistake in their campaign of erasure. They had forgotten that I wasn't just Clara's mother or their former business partner. I was Dr. Susan Davis, a scientist trained to document everything to preserve evidence and to pursue truth regardless of personal cost. And I still had evidence they didn't know existed. The final assault on my dignity came delivered by courier on a gray Tuesday morning, the legal papers bearing the cold authority of corporate law. Mr. Roberts had outdone himself in crafting a document that was both legally devastating and personally cruel. Dear Dr. Davis, the letter began the formal address, a mockery after years of being called Susan by people who now treated me like a stranger. The board of directors has voted unanimously to terminate your consulting arrangement with Innovative Biologics, effective immediately. Your access to company premises, digital systems, and proprietary information has been revoked due to insubordination and actions detrimental to company reputation. The letter went on to detail how they were exercising their right to buy out my remaining minimal shares I had purchased with my own retirement savings at a price that was insultingly below market value. They cited disruptive behavior and unfounded ownership claims as justification for what amounted to forced theft under the protection of corporate bylaws. But the cruelest part was the personal restraining order that accompanied the business termination. I was legally prohibited from contacting Clara, Greg, or Michael, or from coming within 500 feet of the company offices. My own daughter had obtained a legal order, treating me like a dangerous stalker, transforming my love and concern into evidence of instability. The systematic nature of my erasure was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Within hours of receiving the termination notice, I discovered that my name had been removed from the company website, my photo deleted from the Our History section, and my contributions to their breakthrough research attributed to collaborative team efforts with no individual credit given. They were rewriting history in real time, and they had the lawyers and the money to make their version stick. In my desperation, I tried one last approach to reach the daughter I had raised, the woman I still believed existed somewhere beneath the calculating corporate executive she had become. I spent an entire weekend creating a memory book, carefully arranging photographs that documented our journey together, Clara as a child, wide-eyed with wonder during visits to my laboratory. The two of us working side by side during the company's first year, surrounded by equipment we could barely afford. Michael's first visit to our startup, proud to show his friends where his brilliant grandmother and mother were changing the world. I wrote a letter to accompany the photographs, pouring my heart onto the page in a way I had never done before. I reminded Clara of our shared dreams, Our late-night conversations about using science to make the world better. The promises we had made to each other about never letting success change who we were at our core. My dearest Clara, I wrote, I know you're angry with me, and I understand that business has become complicated in ways we never anticipated when we started this journey together. But I want you to remember that before all the lawyers and corporate structures and public relations strategies, we were simply a mother and daughter who shared a love of discovery and a belief that we could build something meaningful together. These pictures represent real moments, real joy, real love that can't be erased by legal documents or rewritten by corporate bylaws. I left the memory book at Clara's house after midnight, carefully placing it by the front door where she would find it in the morning. For a brief moment, standing in the darkness outside the home where my grandson was sleeping, I allowed myself to hope that seeing our shared history might awaken something in Clara that legal threats and business pressures had buried. 3 days later, Greg posted a photo on social media that shattered what remained of my heart. It showed my memory book torn apart, the photographs I had carefully selected scattered across their garbage can like discarded trash. The caption read, "Cleaning out the dead weight. Time for a real future." The image had been crafted for maximum humiliation, showing not just the destroyed photographs, but the torn pages of my letter fragments of my most vulnerable words, visible among the garbage. Clara had not only allowed this destruction, she had participated in it, choosing public mockery over private compassion. The social media post was shared and liked by their business associates, turning my pain into entertainment for people who saw my destruction as proof of Clara and Greg's business sophistication. I had become a cautionary tale about what happened to people who couldn't accept that family relationships were secondary to corporate success. Clara's response to my gesture was swift and final. A text message arrived that evening, cold and businesslike. "It's done, Mom. Don't contact us about the business again, ever." Greg was less restrained in his victory. Within days, I began receiving calls from former colleagues and industry contacts, their voices carefully neutral as they asked if I was all right. Greg had been busy spreading rumors that I was having difficulty accepting retirement and was becoming fixated on conspiracy theories about my own daughter's success. The Whisper campaign was sophisticated and devastating. People who had once respected my scientific achievements now spoke to me with the careful patience reserved for elderly relatives who were losing their grip on reality. I had become a figure of pity, a cautionary tale about what happened when accomplished women couldn't gracefully step aside for the next generation. But it was in my darkest hour, sitting alone in my small apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life's work that had been stolen from me, that I finally admitted the most painful truth of all. Dr. Patricia Wong, the patent attorney who had helped me navigate the early legal challenges of the startup, called to check on my welfare after hearing rumors about my difficulties with Clara's company. Patricia had been a friend, as well as a professional colleague, someone who understood both the scientific and business sides of innovation. "Susan," she said gently, "I know this situation has been devastating for you, but I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there anything about your contributions to the company that you haven't told me? Anything that might give us more leverage in challenging their claims?" And that's when I finally spoke the secret I had carried for 4 years, the truth that made Clara's theft not just cruel, but cosmically ironic. "Patricia," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the breakthrough process that launched the company, the technology that Clara claims to have invented, wasn't her discovery at all. It was mine. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for long seconds before Patricia spoke. "What do you mean, Susan?" "The molecular synthesis method that made us millions of dollars in licensing fees, I developed that process 15 years ago during my independent research. I had all the patents ready to file, all the documentation complete, but I decided the market wasn't ready for that level of innovation, so I shelved the project." The words came faster now, decades of suppressed truth finally finding their voice. When Clara was struggling to find her breakthrough concept, when she was desperate for something that would distinguish her company from all the other biotech startups, I gave her my research, all of it, every equation, every methodology, every carefully documented experiment. Patricia's intake of breath was audible. "Susan, do you still have the original documentation?" "Everything I said. Lab notebooks, computer files, preliminary patent applications. I have 15 years of evidence that the revolutionary Morrison method is actually the Davis process developed entirely through my own research and handed to Clara as a gift to launch her career." The irony was overwhelming. Clara was publicly celebrating her innovative genius while profiting from technology that was actually my creation given to her in an act of maternal love and now being used as evidence of my obsolescence. "She doesn't even know," I continued, my voice breaking with the weight of years of hidden sacrifice. "Clara thinks she developed the process through her own brilliance. I never told her the truth because I wanted her to have confidence in her own abilities. I wanted her to believe she was capable of revolutionary thinking. The most devastating part wasn't just that Clara had stolen from me. It was that she had stolen something I had freely given her, then used it to justify treating me as a burden and an obstacle to progress." As I sat in my empty apartment that night, finally having spoken the truth that had burned inside me for years, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. The fog of self-doubt and confusion that had surrounded me since Clara's betrayal was finally lifting. I wasn't a delusional old woman clinging to fantasies of importance. I wasn't a failed businesswoman who didn't understand modern corporate realities. I was Dr. Susan Davis, the actual inventor of the technology that had made Clara's success possible, and I had documentation to prove it. Clara and Greg had made the mistake of believing their own narrative about my irrelevance. They had convinced themselves that I was just a bitter ex-employee with delusions of grandeur, someone who could be safely ignored and legally silenced. But they had forgotten the most important lesson I had tried to teach Clara about scientific research: always keep detailed records, because the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. My name is Susan, and I am 65 years old. I am a scientist and inventor, and a woman who has been systematically erased from her own life's work. But I am not finished yet. The weeks following my devastating conversation with Patricia Wong became a nightmare of systematic destruction that went far beyond simple family betrayal. Clara and Greg, apparently sensing that I possessed more evidence than they had anticipated, launched a coordinated campaign to destroy not just my claims to the company, but my entire professional existence. The attack began subtly, as the most effective character assassinations always do. Dr. Richard Chen, whom I had known for 20 years through the American Association of Molecular Biology, called me with what he described as concerns from the community. "Susan," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news, "there have been some troubling rumors circulating about your work at Innovative Biologics. people are saying there may have been ethical compromises in some of your research, possibly even issues with data integrity. My blood turned to ice. What kind of rumors, Richard? Nothing specific, you understand, but there are whispers about unreliable colleagues and questions about whether some of the foundational research was conducted according to proper protocols. I'm not saying I believe any of this, but the talk is affecting how people view your contributions to the field. The conversation revealed the sophistication of Clara and Greg's campaign. They weren't making direct accusations that could be challenged or disproven. Instead, they were spreading carefully crafted doubts that poisoned professional relationships without providing any target for rebuttal. Within days, I began receiving polite rejections from conferences where I had been invited to speak. The National Science Foundation quietly removed me from a grant review panel I had served on for 5 years. Former colleagues stopped returning my calls, and when I encountered them at professional gatherings, they spoke to me with the careful distance reserved for people whose reputations had become radioactive. The most devastating blow came when the Regional Biotech Innovation Council announced their annual Community Impact Award ceremony. Clara and Greg were to be honored as visionary leaders who were mentoring the next generation of scientists. The event was covered by local media and streamed online to industry professionals across the country. I watched from my small apartment as my daughter stood at the podium radiant in her success and moral authority. "We believe in nurturing young talent," she said, her voice carrying the measured confidence of someone speaking from unassailable moral ground. Too often we see examples of older researchers who become obsessed with past achievements, unable to accept that science must evolve and progress. She never mentioned my name, but everyone in the industry knew who she was talking about. Greg, standing beside her, added his own carefully crafted barbs. Innovation requires the courage to move beyond outdated methodologies and embrace new paradigms. Not everyone has the vision to see where the field is heading, and sometimes we have to make difficult decisions about which voices deserve to be heard. The audience of young scientists applauded enthusiastically, seeing Clara and Greg as the future of their field, and implicitly understanding that I represented the obsolete past that needed to be discarded. I had become a cautionary tale, a warning about what happened to scientists who couldn't gracefully step aside for the next generation. The financial pressure intensified daily, like a vice slowly tightening around my remaining resources. The legal fees from fighting their buyout attempt had already consumed most of my emergency savings. The loss of consulting income combined with my newly toxic professional reputation left me scrambling to cover basic living expenses for the first time in my adult life. I was forced to sell my grandmother's jewelry, the pieces she had given me when I earned my doctorate. My small collection of rare scientific books, accumulated over decades of careful purchases, went to dealers who paid pennies on the dollar for what had once been my pride and joy. The elegant furniture from my former home was replaced by secondhand pieces that fit in my cramped studio apartment. The stress manifested physically in ways that terrified me. My hands, once steady enough to manipulate delicate laboratory equipment, developed a tremor that made simple tasks like writing or holding a coffee cup embarrassing exercises in concentration. I lost 15 pounds in 6 weeks, my clothes hanging loose on my shrinking frame like evidence of my diminishing relevance. Sleep became elusive, my nights filled with anxiety about money, about reputation, about the growing certainty that I was losing every battle that mattered. When I did manage to rest, I woke feeling more exhausted than when I had gone to bed, as if my body was rejecting the very idea of peace. But the cruelest blow was yet to come, delivered through the medium that had become Clara and Greg's weapon of choice, social media. The video appeared on the company's official channels on a Thursday afternoon, professionally produced and carefully scripted for maximum impact. The title read, "Future Innovators, the Next Generation Speaks." Michael, my grandson, appeared on screen looking confident and mature, every inch the brilliant young man I had helped raise. "I'm excited to be working with real visionaries," he said, his 15-year-old voice carrying adult authority. "People who understand that modern science requires courage to move beyond outdated approaches. My parents have taught me that innovation means being willing to challenge assumptions even when older researchers can't adapt to new realities." He was standing in the laboratory I had helped design, surrounded by equipment I had helped purchase with my retirement savings. But there was no acknowledgement of my contributions, no recognition that the outdated approaches he was dismissing had created the foundation for everything he was celebrating. The camera focused on Michael's face as he delivered what felt like a prepared statement. "I'm proud to be part of a company that values scientific integrity and forward-thinking leadership. We're building something that will change the world, and we can't let outdated thinking hold us back." The words were clearly coached, but they came from my grandson's mouth with apparent sincerity. The young man who had once spent weekends in my home laboratory, fascinated by the mysteries of molecular biology, was now publicly dismissing me as an obstacle to progress. The video's comment section filled with praise for Michael's mature perspective and appreciation for Clara and Greg's mentorship of young talent. I had become the unnamed antagonist in their success story, the bitter old woman whose outdated ideas had to be overcome for true innovation to flourish. That evening alone in my studio apartment, with the lights of the city twinkling beyond my single window, I felt the weight of complete defeat settling around me like a shroud. My professional reputation was in ruins, my financial security was gone, and my own family had transformed me into a public example of scientific obsolescence. But as I sorted through boxes of papers I was preparing to store in the building's basement, my fingers found something that stopped me cold. A yellowed envelope tucked between old research journals containing a handwritten note I had forgotten existed. "Dear Dr. Davis," the letter read, "I hope you remember me. I was the awkward graduate student who nearly dropped out of your research methods course 15 years ago. I wanted to thank you for refusing to let me give up on myself. Your unwavering belief in scientific integrity and your tough but fair guidance saved not just my career, but my faith in what science could accomplish when conducted with genuine ethical commitment." The letter was signed by someone whose name I barely remembered, a struggling student who had seemed unremarkable at the time. But the words carried a weight that transcended their simple sentiment. I had made a difference. I had shaped minds and careers in ways that Clara and Greg's corporate success could never touch. Reading that forgotten thank you note, I felt something awakening within me that I thought had been destroyed by months of betrayal and humiliation. I was Dr. Susan Davis, and I had spent 40 years building a legacy of scientific integrity that extended far beyond any single company or any single discovery. They could steal my money, destroy my reputation, and turn my family against me. But they could not erase the fundamental truth of who I was and what I had contributed to the field I loved. I still had work to do. The realization that I still possessed allies within the company came through an encrypted email that appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning, sent from an address I didn't recognize, but containing information only someone with intimate knowledge of our internal systems could possess. Dr. Davis, the message read, "I hope you remember me. I worked under your supervision during the early days, and I've watched with growing horror as Clara and Greg have perverted everything you built this company to represent. We need to talk." The signature identified the sender as David Martinez, our former head of IT security. David had been one of my most trusted employees during the startup's first years, a brilliant systems architect who had helped me design the comprehensive security protocols that protected our intellectual property and financial records. We met at a small coffee shop 40 miles from the city, a location chosen for its anonymity and distance from anyone who might recognize us. David looked older than his 45 years, his face lined with the stress of someone carrying burdens he couldn't publicly share. "Susan," he said without preamble, "I need you to know that Clara and Greg are using your own security systems against the people you trusted to build this company. The monitoring protocols you designed to prevent corporate espionage, they're now using them to spy on employees who might question their leadership or leak information about their financial irregularities." The irony was devastating. The comprehensive surveillance network I had created to protect the company from external threats was being used to silence internal dissent and ensure that Clara and Greg's corruption remained hidden from board oversight. "It gets worse," David continued, glancing around the nearly empty cafe. "They've been systematically altering the historical records stored in our digital archives. Financial documents, research logs, even email communications from the early years. They're rewriting the company's history to minimize your contributions and justify their current ownership structure." He slid a small flash drive across the table. "But they made one crucial mistake. They don't know about the shadow backup system you had me install in 2019, the one designed to preserve critical data even if the main servers were compromised. Everything is there, Susan. Every original document, every unaltered financial record, every piece of evidence that proves what they've stolen from you." That evening, with David's technical guidance provided through encrypted communications, I accessed the shadow system using credentials that Clara and Greg didn't know existed. What I found was a treasure trove of evidence that documented not just their theft of my contributions, but their ongoing financial fraud and corporate malfeasance. The shell corporations Greg had created to divert company funds were all documented in detail, complete with bank account numbers and transaction records that showed millions of dollars being siphoned away from legitimate business operations. The digital watermarks I had embedded in crucial documents revealed extensive tampering, providing irrefutable proof that they had altered contracts and agreements to support their fraudulent claims. Most damning of all were the internal communications between Clara Gregg and their legal team messages that revealed their conscious intent to defraud me and their awareness that their actions constituted criminal behavior. In one email exchange, Greg had written, "The old woman doesn't have the resources to fight us properly. We just need to keep the pressure on until she gives up or dies." But the discovery that truly broke my heart came through another flash drive, this one delivered by Sarah Rodriguez, a young researcher I had personally mentored during her graduate studies. Sarah had been like a daughter to me during the company's early years, someone I had trusted with my most sensitive research and groomed to carry forward the ethical standards I had tried to instill in our work culture. "Dr. Davis," Sarah said when we met in the same anonymous cafe where I had encountered David, "I need to confess something that's been eating me alive for months. Clara and Greg offered me a substantial bonus and a promotion to help them modify some of the foundational research records." Her voice broke as she continued, They convinced me that you were trying to take credit for work that belonged to the company, that adjusting the historical records was necessary to protect everyone's interests. I helped them alter patent applications, research notes, even some of the audio recordings you had made during early planning sessions. The betrayal by someone I had nurtured and guided cut deeper than Clara's family treachery. Sarah had embodied everything I believed about the next generation of scientists, ethical, brilliant, committed to truth above personal advancement. To learn that she had been corrupted by Clara and Greg's manipulation felt like discovering that the very foundation of scientific integrity was built on sand. But I kept copies of everything, Sarah said, sliding another flash drive across the table with trembling hands. The original versions before we altered them. I told myself it was just insurance, but really, I think I knew what we were doing was wrong. I've been carrying this guilt for months, and I can't do it anymore. The evidence Sarah provided was devastating in its completeness. Not only did it prove that Clara and Greg had systematically falsified historical records, but it demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate digital evidence while creating plausible deniability for their actions. Armed with this overwhelming proof of fraud and corruption, I contacted Patricia Wong to discuss our legal options. But Patricia's response revealed just how thoroughly Clara and Greg had poisoned the well of institutional support. "Susan," Patricia said during our phone conversation, "I've tried to approach some of the independent board members with preliminary information about financial irregularities at Innovative Biologics, but Mr. Roberts has apparently prepared them for exactly this kind of challenge." She paused, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. "They've been told that you're likely to make increasingly desperate accusations as your mental state deteriorates, and that any evidence you present should be viewed with extreme skepticism. One board member actually told me that Clara had warned them you might try to fabricate documents to support your delusional claims." The sophistication of their preemptive strike was breathtaking. Clara and Greg had not only stolen from me and covered their tracks, they had also created a narrative framework that would discredit any evidence I might eventually present. My reputation for scientific precision and ethical behavior, built over 4 decades of careful work, had been transformed into liability that made my most compelling evidence appear suspect. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "I've learned that Clara and Greg have been quietly buying out the independent board members, offering lucrative consulting contracts and stock options to ensure their loyalty. The board that was supposed to provide oversight of their actions has been compromised by their financial influence." As I sat in my small apartment that night, surrounded by flash drives containing irrefutable proof of Clara and Greg's criminal behavior, I realized that having evidence was only half the battle. The other half was finding someone with the power and integrity to act on that evidence, and Clara and Greg had systematically corrupted or intimidated everyone who might have served that function. But they had made one crucial miscalculation in their campaign to silence me. They had assumed that a 65-year-old woman, isolated from her family and professional community, would eventually be overwhelmed by the magnitude of their institutional power. They had forgotten that I wasn't just any 65-year-old woman. I was a scientist trained to pursue truth, regardless of personal cost, someone who had spent decades learning how complex systems could be analyzed, understood, and ultimately exposed when they were built on lies. The evidence I now possessed wasn't just proof of their crimes, it was a roadmap to their destruction. And I finally understood that beating Clara and Greg wouldn't require matching their financial resources or their political influence. It would simply require the patience to document their corruption thoroughly, and the courage to find the right person to listen when I was ready to tell the complete story. The final assault on my existence came disguised as corporate housekeeping, delivered through legal documents that transformed 40 years of careful financial planning into a weapon designed to destroy me. Mr. Roberts called on a Monday morning, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone about to deliver a checkmate. "Susan," he said, dispensing with even basic courtesy, "I'm calling to inform you that the company has identified significant financial irregularities that occurred during your tenure as founding director. We'll be filing formal demands for immediate restitution." My hand trembled as I gripped the phone. "What kind of irregularities?" "A thorough audit has revealed that you apparently mismanaged several crucial financial instruments and loan guarantees from the company's early years. Specifically, there's a complex debt structure that you personally guaranteed in 2019, which now requires immediate payment due to changes in the company's risk assessment." The legal documents that arrived by courier that afternoon were a masterpiece of financial manipulation disguised as legitimate debt collection. Hidden in pages of dense legal language was a trap I had unknowingly signed years earlier, a personal guarantee on a balloon payment loan that Clara and Greg could trigger at their discretion. When I had signed the document 4 years ago, it had been presented as a formality, a backup provision that would never be used because the company's cash flow made early repayment unnecessary. But Clara and Greg had restructured the debt, manipulating interest rates and payment schedules to create a massive financial obligation that they could now demand I satisfy personally. The amount was devastating, nearly $2 million, due within 30 days, or face immediate bankruptcy proceedings that would strip away my remaining assets and destroy my credit rating permanently. But the financial attack was only the beginning of their coordinated assault. Within hours of receiving the debt demand, I discovered that Clara and Greg had simultaneously filed a civil lawsuit against me, claiming that my financial mismanagement during the company's early years had caused substantial losses that required restitution. The lawsuit sought an additional $3 million in damages, effectively claiming that my leadership of the company I had founded had been so incompetent that I owed them money for the privilege of having built their success. The lawsuit was accompanied by a sophisticated media campaign designed to destroy what remained of my public reputation. Carefully edited financial documents, taken from the altered records Sarah had helped them create, were leaked to industry publications and business news outlets. The documents painted a picture of financial recklessness and ethical compromise that bore no resemblance to the careful conservative approach I had actually taken to the company's growth. The headline in BioBusiness Weekly read, "Founding Mother or Fraudulent Founder, Innovative Biologic Seeks Recovery from Former Leader's Financial Mismanagement." The article, clearly written from information provided by Clara and Greg's public relations team, portrayed me as an example of what happened when academic scientists attempted to manage complex business operations without proper training or oversight. Sources close to the company, the article reported, indicate that Dr. Susan Davis's outdated accounting practices and resistance to modern financial controls created substantial liabilities that are only now being discovered through comprehensive auditing procedures. The most devastating part of the article was a quote attributed to Clara. "It's heartbreaking to discover that someone you trusted and respected may have compromised the company's financial integrity through well-intentioned but ultimately harmful decisions. We're committed to transparency and accountability even when it involves difficult family relationships." The words were carefully crafted to sound more sorrowful than accusatory, positioning Clara as a reluctant whistleblower who was bravely exposing corruption rather than a daughter destroying her mother's reputation for personal gain. Michael's role in this character assassination was perhaps the most painful element of their campaign. In an interview with the local business journal, my 15-year-old grandson spoke with the assured confidence of someone who had been carefully coached in talking points. It's been really educational to see how my parents are handling this situation, he said, looking mature and thoughtful for the cameras. They're showing me what real leadership looks like, how to take responsibility for cleaning up past mistakes and ensuring the company has a sustainable future. When asked about his relationship with me, Michael's response was delivered with practiced sympathy. I hope Grandma Susan gets the help she needs. It must be difficult to realize that your approach to business wasn't as successful as you thought it was. But my parents are teaching me that sometimes you have to make hard decisions for the good of everyone involved. The calculated nature of his comments, simultaneously expressing concern while reinforcing the narrative of my incompetence, revealed the depth of Clara and Greg's manipulation. They had transformed my grandson into a spokesperson for their version of reality, using his apparent sincerity to legitimize their attacks on my character and competence. The relentless pressure of legal threats, financial demands, and public humiliation took a devastating toll on my physical health. The constant stress, combined with poor sleep and irregular eating habits forced by my shrinking budget, created a perfect storm of physiological collapse. I was in my kitchen trying to make sense of the latest legal documents while calculating whether I could afford both groceries and heating that month, when the crushing pain in my chest announced that my body had reached its breaking point. The heart attack wasn't massive, but it was significant enough to require hospitalization and to serve as a terrifying reminder of my mortality. Lying alone in the cardiac unit, connected to monitors that tracked the irregular rhythm of my damaged heart, I faced the very real possibility that Clara and Greg's campaign of destruction might literally kill me before I could expose their crimes. The nurses spoke to me with the gentle concern reserved for elderly patients who had no family visitors, no flowers or cards to brighten their sterile surroundings. But it was during those lonely hours in the hospital that I received an unexpected visitor who reminded me that not everyone had been corrupted by Clara and Greg's influence. Dr. Margaret Thompson, my former lead scientist from the company's early years, appeared at my bedside on a quiet Thursday afternoon. At 72, she moved slowly, but with the determined purpose of someone who had made a difficult decision and intended to follow through with it. "Susan," she said, without preamble, settling into the visitor's chair with the authority of someone who belonged there, "I've been watching this circus from a distance, and I can't stay silent anymore." Margaret opened her worn leather briefcase and withdrew a thick folder filled with handwritten laboratory notes, experimental data, and research observations that dated back to the company's founding years. I kept meticulous records of everything we did during those early years, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in pursuit of scientific truth. Every experiment, every breakthrough, every moment of brilliant insight that Clara and Greg are now claiming as their own innovation. She spread the documents across my hospital bed table like evidence in a court case. These notes prove beyond any doubt that the foundational research underlying their current success was developed under your direct supervision, using methodologies you designed, following protocols you established. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes bright with the fierce intelligence that had made her one of the most respected researchers in our field. More importantly, These records document Clara and Greg's recent attempts to alter historical data and manipulate research outcomes. I've been quietly collecting evidence of their scientific misconduct for months, waiting for the right moment to act. As I examined Margaret's carefully preserved documentation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Here was irrefutable proof that my contributions to the company were not just legitimate, but foundational, created by someone whose integrity and scientific credentials were beyond question. "Susan," Margaret said, placing her hand gently on mine, "I know they've made you feel isolated and powerless, but you're not alone in this fight. There are people in the scientific community who remember what integrity looks like, and we're not going to let them destroy your legacy without a battle." Lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by the evidence of my own scientific achievements and the support of someone who understood the true value of ethical research, I felt my determination returning like blood flow to a limb that had been numb. Clara and Greg had made the mistake of believing that financial pressure and public humiliation would be enough to silence me permanently. They had forgotten that the most dangerous opponent is not someone who has everything to lose, but someone who has already lost everything and therefore has nothing left to fear. The video camera in my hospital room felt heavy in my trembling hands, but I knew this might be my only chance to speak directly to Clara before the legal machinery Clara and Greg had set in motion destroyed any possibility of reconciliation. The heart attack had weakened my body, but it had also clarified my priorities in a way that months of betrayal had not managed to achieve. Margaret Thompson had helped me compose what I hoped would be my final personal appeal to my daughter, a message that stripped away all the legal complications and business disputes to focus on the fundamental relationship that had once defined both our lives. With the camera's red light glowing like a small beacon of hope, I began to speak. "Clara, my darling daughter." I said, my voice still rough from the breathing tube, but carrying all the maternal love I had accumulated over 37 years. "I'm recording this message from my hospital bed, where I've had time to think about everything that's happened between us, and to remember who we used to be before lawyers and corporate structures and public relations strategies changed everything." I paused, gathering strength for what I knew would be an emotionally devastating confession. "I need you to know that I don't care about the money, sweetheart. I don't care about the company ownership or the patents or any of the legal documents that have caused so much pain between us. What I care about is you and the brilliant ethical scientist I raised you to become." From the folder Margaret had left with me, I withdrew one of the original audio recordings from our early planning sessions, the ones that captured Clara's voice, acknowledging our partnership in terms that no legal manipulation could erase. "Listen to your own voice, Clara," I said, playing a brief excerpt where she could be heard saying, "Mom, I know this company wouldn't exist without your expertise and your financial sacrifice. You're not just my mother, you're my founding partner and my most trusted advisor." The recording continued with Clara's younger voice, full of excitement and genuine affection. "I want to build something that honors everything you've taught me about ethical science and responsible business practices. We're going to show the world that success doesn't require compromising your principles." As the recording ended, I looked directly into the camera with all the intensity I could muster. "That's who you really are, Clara. Not the person Greg and his lawyers have convinced you to become, but the daughter who once believed that family loyalty was more important than corporate success." I shared memories that only Clara and I knew, the late nights we had spent troubleshooting equipment problems, the moment when our first major experiment had succeeded, and we had embraced in the laboratory like partners in discovery the conversation we had shared about using our success to create opportunities for other women in science. I gave you my retirement savings because I believed in your dream. I concluded, my voice breaking with emotion. I gave you my expertise because I wanted to see you succeed. And I gave you my own research discoveries because I thought our legacy would be shared, not stolen. Please remember who we used to be, sweetheart. Please remember that there's still time to make this right. And the nurse who had helped me record the message, a compassionate woman named Jennifer, who had worked with many elderly patients facing family crises, promised to ensure that the video reached Clara personally. But what we didn't know was that Greg had already bribed several hospital staff members to monitor my communications, treating my recovery period as an opportunity to gather intelligence about my legal strategy. The video was intercepted before Clara ever saw it falling into Greg's hands like a weapon he had been waiting to receive. What happened next was a masterclass in digital manipulation and media warfare that transformed my most vulnerable moment into evidence of my supposed mental instability. Within 48 hours, a heavily edited version of my hospital video appeared on national news broadcasts, but it had been transformed into something unrecognizable. My expressions of love and concern had been edited to seem desperate and delusional. The audio recordings I had played as evidence of Clara's original partnership acknowledgement had been altered to make them sound like fantasies or manipulated evidence. Most devastatingly, my physical appearance, weakened by the heart attack and filmed in the harsh lighting of a hospital room, was used to support a narrative about my declining mental state. The news anchors spoke about me with the kind of concerned sympathy usually reserved for tragic cases of elderly dementia, presenting my plea for reconciliation as evidence of an unstable woman's inability to accept reality. The news segment was introduced by a perfectly coiffed anchor who warned viewers about a disturbing case of family conflict that highlights the challenges of caring for aging relatives who may be losing their grip on reality. Greg appeared as the primary expert commentator, dressed in an expensive suit and speaking with the calm authority of someone dealing with a difficult family situation with remarkable patience. It's heartbreaking to watch someone you care about struggle with these kinds of delusions, he said, his voice carefully modulated to convey both concern and authority. Susan has always been a brilliant scientist, but the stress of retirement and the natural changes that come with aging seem to have created a fixation on conspiracy theories and imagined injustices. Clara's performance in the same news segment was even more devastating. Appearing via satellite from the company's conference room, she looked professional and composed every inch the successful executive dealing with a family crisis with remarkable grace. My mother has been struggling with increasing confusion and paranoia since her heart attack, Clara said, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion. We've tried to get her the help she needs, but she's resistant to treatment and seems to believe that everyone around her is plotting against her. The interviewer asked Clara about the evidence I had presented in my hospital video, giving her an opportunity to dismiss my audio recordings as either altered or taken completely out of context from normal family conversations. It's particularly painful, Clara continued, because she's using our private family moments as supposed proof of business relationships that never existed in any legal or professional sense. She's turning our love for each other into evidence for claims that simply aren't supported by any documentation. But the cruelest moment came when Michael was brought into the television interview, clearly coached, but appearing genuinely concerned about his grandmother's welfare. I love Grandma Susan, and I want her to get better," he said, looking directly into the camera with the earnest sincerity that only teenagers can muster. But it's scary to see her making up stories about things that didn't happen. My parents have been so patient with her, but she keeps accusing them of things that don't make sense. He held up a product from the company, a pharmaceutical device that incorporated the molecular synthesis process I had developed, and spoke about it as if it represented entirely Clara and Greg's innovation. This is what my parents have built through their hard work and vision. It's sad that Grandma thinks she deserves credit for other people's achievements. The television segment reached millions of viewers, cementing my public image as a tragic case of an elderly woman whose mental deterioration had led her to develop paranoid fantasies about her own family. The story was picked up by other news outlets, shared on social media, and discussed in industry publications as an example of the challenges facing families dealing with aging relatives who couldn't accept their declining relevance. But in the midst of this complete public humiliation, something unexpected happened that would change the trajectory of my fight for justice. Rebecca Martinez, an award-winning investigative journalist from the Washington Herald, had been researching patterns of elder abuse in prominent American families when she saw the televised coverage of my story. Something about the polished nature of Clara and Greg's responses, combined with inconsistencies she noticed in their financial claims, triggered her investigative instincts. Rebecca had built her career on exposing cases where powerful people used legal and media manipulation to silence vulnerable victims. She had won a Pulitzer Prize for uncovering a pharmaceutical company's campaign to discredit elderly patients who had suffered adverse reactions to their products. When Rebecca called Patricia Wong to discuss my case, she brought resources and expertise that Clara and Greg hadn't anticipated facing. "I've seen this pattern before," Rebecca told Patricia during their initial conversation. The coordinated media campaign, the legal pressure designed to exhaust the victim's resources, the systematic isolation from potential allies. This has all the hallmarks of a sophisticated elder abuse operation. Rebecca's interest in my story represented something Clara and Greg's money and influence couldn't control the attention of a journalist whose reputation was built on exposing exactly the kind of institutional corruption they had used to destroy my life. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was no longer fighting alone against an opponent with unlimited resources. I now had an ally whose weapon was the truth and whose platform could reach millions of people who might finally hear my actual story rather than the distorted version Clara and Greg had created. The battle was far from over, but the terms of engagement had fundamentally changed. Clara and Greg had made the mistake of assuming that completely destroying my reputation would end my ability to threaten their empire. They were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is someone who has been publicly humiliated and has nothing left to lose but the truth. Rebecca Martinez's investigation had uncovered something that Clara and Greg never suspected existed: a secret fund I had established decades earlier. Through research grants and consulting fees, money that had been carefully invested and hidden from their systematic theft of my assets. This fund, combined with Rebecca's media connections and Patricia Wong's legal expertise, gave us the resources to mount a comprehensive counterattack. The federal lawsuit we filed was unlike anything the biotech industry had ever seen. The charges were sweeping and devastating: corporate fraud, elder abuse, intellectual property theft, conspiracy to commit perjury, and international defamation. But more importantly, We had assembled a legal team that matched Clara and Greg's resources while surpassing their commitment to truth. Rebecca's articles in the Washington Herald had already begun to shift public opinion, presenting evidence that the mentally unstable grandmother narrative was actually a sophisticated cover-up for systematic corporate crime. Her investigative reporting had revealed inconsistencies in Clara and Greg's financial claims, documented patterns of elder abuse in their treatment of other investors, and exposed the media manipulation campaign they had orchestrated to destroy my reputation. The trial attracted global attention, not just because of the dramatic family betrayal angle that media outlets found irresistible, but because it represented a landmark case in corporate elder abuse prosecution. Legal experts called it a defining moment for how courts would handle sophisticated financial fraud targeting elderly family members. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed with reporters, industry observers, and supporters who had rallied to my cause after Rebecca's articles revealed the true scope of Clara and Greg's deception. For the first time in over a year, I felt the support of people who understood that this case was about more than just family drama. It was about fundamental questions of justice and corporate integrity. Patricia Wong opened our case with a presentation that was both devastating and methodical, laying out the evidence with the precision of someone who had spent decades exposing corporate fraud. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you are about to witness the systematic dismantling of one of the most sophisticated elder abuse conspiracies ever documented. The defendants didn't just steal Dr. Susan Davis's money, they stole her intellectual property, her professional reputation, and her family relationships, all while using the legal system as a weapon to silence their victim. The centerpiece of our case was the shadow accounting system that David Martinez had helped me access, combined with the original documentation that Margaret Thompson and Sarah Rodriguez had preserved. When our forensic accountant, Dr. James Walsh, presented his analysis of Clara and Greg's financial manipulation, the impact was immediate and devastating. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Walsh displayed chart after chart, showing how Clara and Greg had systematically diverted company funds through shell corporations, inflated their salaries, through fraudulent consulting agreements, and manipulated research budgets to fund personal expenses. The digital watermarks I had embedded in foundational documents revealed extensive tampering, providing irrefutable proof that they had altered contracts and historical records to support their fraudulent claims. What we see here, Dr. Walsh explained, pointing to a timeline that showed millions of dollars in suspicious transactions, is not just poor business judgment or aggressive financial strategies. This is deliberate systematic theft that was carefully concealed through sophisticated accounting manipulation and document forgery. But the most devastating evidence was yet to come. When Patricia Wong played the original unaltered audio recordings of Clara acknowledging our partnership, the contrast with their current claims was stark and undeniable. "Listen to Clara Morrison's own words," Patricia said, as Clara's younger voice filled the courtroom. "Mom, I need you to know that everything we're building here is truly ours together. You're not just my mother, you're my founding partner and my most trusted advisor. This company wouldn't exist without your expertise, your financial sacrifice, and your unwavering support." The recording continued, with Clara discussing our shared vision for ethical scientific research and her gratitude for my willingness to invest my retirement savings in our joint venture. Her voice was warm, sincere, and completely contradicted every claim their legal team had made about my role in the company. As the evidence mounted, I watched Clara's carefully constructed facade begin to crumble. The confident CEO who had dismissed me as a delusional old woman was gradually replaced by someone who looked increasingly desperate and trapped by her own lies. When Patricia Wong called Clara to testify, the transformation was complete. The woman who took the witness stand bore little resemblance to the polished executive who had orchestrated my destruction. Her hands shook as she swore to tell the truth, and her voice was barely audible as she attempted to maintain her version of events in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence. Ms. Morrison, Patricia, said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who knew she was about to deliver a knockout blow. "Do you recognize your own voice in the recordings we just heard?" Clara's answer was a whispered yes. "And in those recordings, you explicitly acknowledge Dr. Davis as your founding partner and co-owner of the company, correct?" The pause before Clara's response seemed to last forever. When she finally spoke, her voice broke completely. I don't remember. I might have said things, but the legal documents." That's when Clara's psychological collapse became complete and public. The realization that her own words had provided irrefutable evidence of her perjury, combined with the overwhelming proof of her financial crimes, shattered her composure entirely. She began weeping uncontrollably, her sobs echoing through the silent courtroom as the full magnitude of her situation became clear. This wasn't just about losing a lawsuit. This was about facing criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and the complete destruction of everything she had built through lies and manipulation. "I'm sorry," she whispered through her tears, looking directly at me for the first time since the trial began. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't know how it got this bad. I don't know who I became." The sight of my daughter's complete breakdown was simultaneously vindicating and heartbreaking. This was the moment I had fought for the acknowledgement of truth that I had sacrificed everything to achieve. But seeing Clara reduced to a broken, sobbing figure in a witness chair brought me no joy, only profound sadness for what we had both lost. Greg's attempt to maintain his composure lasted only slightly longer. When confronted with evidence of his role in orchestrating the financial fraud and media manipulation campaign, he tried to flee the courtroom, but was apprehended by court security. His transformation from ruthless corporate manipulator to desperate criminal was as complete as Clara's psychological collapse. Mr. Roberts, their attorney, was immediately subjected to ethics proceedings that would result in his disbarment and criminal charges for his role in the conspiracy. The sophisticated legal machinery that had once seemed invincible was crumbling under the weight of documented evidence and sworn testimony. But the most heartbreaking moment came when I looked across the courtroom and saw Michael sitting in the gallery, his 15-year-old face etched with confusion, horror, and dawning understanding of what his parents had done. The young man who had been coached to dismiss me as a delusional grandmother was witnessing his parents' complete moral and legal collapse. When our eyes met, I saw not the cold distance that had characterized our interactions for months, but the frightened expression of a child whose world was disintegrating around him. The realization that his parents were criminals, that everything he had been taught about the family business was built on lies, was written clearly across his face. As the judge called for a recess to allow Clara to compose herself, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. The truth had finally been revealed, but the cost to everyone involved was devastating. I had won the battle for justice, but the war had destroyed my family in ways that no legal victory could repair. The verdict, when it came, was as comprehensive as it was devastating for Clara and Greg. Judge Patricia Rodriguez spoke with the moral authority of someone who had witnessed one of the most systematic elder abuse cases in her 40 years on the bench. In all my years presiding over corporate fraud cases, she began, I have rarely encountered such a calculated campaign of deception, manipulation, and elder abuse. The defendants did not simply steal money, they attempted to steal their victim's identity, her legacy, and her right to exist as a respected member of her professional community. Clara and Greg were found guilty on all counts, multiple charges of corporate fraud, elder abuse, intellectual property theft, perjury, and conspiracy to commit defamation. Their sentences were severe. Clara received 8 years in federal prison plus full financial restitution, while Greg received 10 years due to his role as the primary architect of the conspiracy. The financial restitution was comprehensive and crushing. They were ordered to repay not only the money they had stolen from me and the company, but additional damages that included compensation for emotional distress, medical expenses from my heart attack, and punitive damages designed to deter similar crimes. The total exceeded $15 million, ensuring that they would spend decades working to repay their victims even after their prison sentences ended. But more importantly than the financial judgment was the restoration of my professional reputation and legal control of the company. The court formally reinstated me as Chairman Emeritus and Chief Scientific Officer with full voting control, acknowledging that innovative biologics had always been built on my intellectual property and financial investment. The company's board, which had been corrupted by Clara and Greg's influence, was dissolved and replaced with ethical leadership drawn from my old guard of loyal former employees. David Martinez returned as Chief Technology Officer. Margaret Thompson became Chief Scientific Advisor, and Sarah Rodriguez was promoted to Director of Research Ethics, her experience with Clara and Greg's corruption making her uniquely qualified to prevent similar abuses. The transformation of the company under ethical leadership was remarkable. Within months, we had reversed Clara and Greg's risky expansion strategies, paid off the debts they had accumulated through their fraudulent schemes, and begun rebuilding relationships with research partners who had been alienated by their aggressive business practices. The molecular synthesis technology that Clara had claimed as her innovation was properly credited to my research with new patents filed that accurately reflected the development timeline and intellectual property ownership. The Morrison method was renamed the Davis process, ensuring that my scientific legacy would be properly preserved for future generations. But the personal cost of victory was profound and lasting. Clara's letter from federal prison arrived 3 months after her sentencing, written on institutional stationery that made her fall from corporate executive to convicted felon starkly real. The letter was 20 pages of rambling text that revealed the depth of her psychological collapse and her desperate attempt to process the magnitude of what she had lost. Dear Mom, she wrote, I know there are no words that can undo what I've done to you, to our family, to the company we once built together. I lie awake every night trying to understand how I became someone who could betray the person who loved me most, who could steal from the woman who gave me everything. The letter continued with painful honesty about how Greg had gradually manipulated her thinking, convincing her that business success required ruthless decision-making, and that family sentiment was a weakness that successful entrepreneurs had to overcome. She described the gradual process by which she had justified increasingly unethical behavior, telling herself that the ends would justify the means, and that I would eventually understand the necessity of her choices. I became someone I don't recognize, she confessed. The daughter you raised would never have done these things. but I lost her somewhere along the way. I traded everything that mattered: our relationship, my integrity, my respect for the scientific principles you taught me, for money and power that turned out to be built on lies. Reading Clara's letter was one of the most painful experiences of my life because it showed me glimpses of the daughter I had raised, buried beneath the criminal she had become. But it also made clear that the woman who had orchestrated my destruction was gone, possibly forever replaced by someone who was trying to piece together an identity from the ruins of her former life. Greg's fate was quite different. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, he spent his pre-sentencing period attempting to blame everyone except himself for the conspiracy's exposure. He filed numerous frivolous appeals, gave angry interviews claiming he was the victim of a vendetta, and continued to spread lies about my mental state even after his conviction. His complete inability to accept accountability for his crimes made him a pariah even among white-collar criminals. Former business associates avoided any contact with him. His professional network dissolved entirely, and he faced his prison sentence as an utterly isolated figure consumed by bitterness and resentment. The impact on Michael was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire situation. My 15-year-old grandson had watched both parents sentenced to federal prison, seen his family's wealth seized to pay restitution to victims, and learned that his entire understanding of his family's success had been built on lies and criminal activity. His letters to me, which began arriving shortly after his parents' sentencing, revealed a young man struggling to process trauma that would have challenged adults with decades more life experience. Dear Grandma Susan, his first letter read, "I don't know what to call you anymore. I spent so long calling you Ms. Susan and thinking you were trying to hurt us, but now I know that Mom and Dad were the ones who were lying. I'm sorry I said those things about you on TV. I'm sorry I believed them when they told me you were trying to steal from us." Michael's subsequent letters chronicled his attempts to understand how his parents had become criminals and what their actions meant for his own future. He had been placed in the care of my ex-husband's sister, a kind woman who was doing her best to provide stability while he processed the trauma of his parents' imprisonment. "I keep wondering if there's something wrong with me too," he wrote in one particularly painful letter. "Like maybe I have the same thing that made Mom and Dad do those terrible things to you. I'm scared that I might turn out like them, that I might hurt people too." The burden of victory weighed heavily on my heart as I read Michael's confused, frightened words. I had achieved everything I had fought for: legal vindication, financial restoration, and the return of my professional legacy. But that victory had come at the cost of my daughter's freedom and my grandson's innocence. Yet despite the profound sadness I felt about Clara's fate and Michael's trauma, I also experienced something I hadn't felt in over 2 years' peace. The constant stress of legal battles and financial uncertainty was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth had prevailed over lies, that integrity had triumphed over corruption. The company that bore my name was once again operating according to the ethical principles I had instilled from its founding. My scientific discoveries were properly credited and being used to benefit humanity rather than enrich criminals. My professional reputation had been not just restored, but enhanced by my courage in fighting for justice against overwhelming odds. As I sat in my restored office, surrounded by the awards and recognition that Clara and Greg had tried to steal from me, I felt gratitude for the allies who had made victory possible, and hoped that the lessons learned from our ordeal would help protect other families from similar betrayals. The truth had exacted a terrible price from everyone involved, but it had also created the foundation for a more authentic and meaningful future than anything built on lies could have provided. 2 years after the trial that restored my life and destroyed Clara's, I stood in the renovated headquarters of Innovative Biologics, watching a new generation of young scientists work with the same passion for discovery that had once driven my own research. The company had been transformed from Clara and Greg's monument to greed into something that truly embodied the ethical vision I had always intended. Under the leadership of our reconstituted management team, Innovative Biologics had become a beacon of integrity in an industry often dominated by profit motives that compromise scientific principles. We had reversed Clara and Greg's risky expansion strategies, paid off their accumulated debts, and rebuilt relationships with research institutions that had been alienated by their aggressive business practices. The Davis process, properly credited and patented under my name, was now being licensed to pharmaceutical companies around the world, generating substantial revenues that were reinvested in ethical research rather than executive enrichment. The molecular synthesis technology that Clara had tried to steal was helping develop treatments for rare diseases, fulfilling the humanitarian goals I had always envisioned for my discoveries. But more important than the company's financial success was its role as a model for ethical business practices in biotechnology. We had implemented comprehensive oversight procedures, transparency requirements, and employee protection policies that prevented the kind of corruption Clara and Greg had perpetrated. The company had become living proof that commercial success and moral integrity were not just compatible, but mutually reinforcing. My role had evolved from operational management to strategic guidance and mentorship. As Chairman Emeritus and Chief Scientific Officer, I spent most of my time working with young entrepreneurs who were starting their own biotech ventures, sharing the hard-won wisdom I had gained from my experience with family betrayal and corporate fraud. The Susan Davis Foundation for Ethical Scientific Innovation, established with funds recovered through the restitution judgment, had become my greatest source of satisfaction. The foundation provided grants to researchers who demonstrated both scientific excellence and unwavering commitment to ethical principles, ensuring that the next generation of innovators would have the resources to pursue breakthrough discoveries without compromising their integrity. Through the foundation's mentorship programs, I worked with dozens of young scientists who reminded me why I had fallen in love with research in the first place. Their enthusiasm for discovery, combined with their commitment to using science for humanitarian purposes, gave me hope that the ethical lapses that had corrupted Clara and Greg were not inevitable consequences of commercial success. The speaking engagements I accepted at universities and professional conferences had evolved into a broader mission of education about the warning signs of corporate corruption and the importance of maintaining ethical standards even under intense financial pressure. My story had become a case study taught in business schools and law schools, helping future leaders understand the personal and professional costs of choosing short-term profits over long-term integrity. Clara's journey remained distant and difficult. Her letters from federal prison continued to arrive monthly, chronicling her slow progress through therapy and her attempts to understand how she had become someone capable of such systematic betrayal. While I read every letter with the love of a mother who remembered the brilliant, ethical young woman Clara had once been, I had accepted that the daughter I had raised was gone, replaced by someone who was trying to rebuild an identity from the wreckage of her choices. "I'm learning to accept responsibility without making excuses," she wrote in one recent letter. "The therapist here says that the first step toward healing is acknowledging that I had choices every step of the way, and I consistently chose greed over love, power, over principle. I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure I never become that person again. The letters showed genuine growth and remorse, but they also made clear that Clara's path to redemption would be long and uncertain. Even if she eventually found peace with her actions, the trust between us had been broken in ways that might never fully heal. Greg's trajectory remained predictably bitter and self-destructive. His appeals had been rejected. His attempts to blame others for his crimes had been dismissed by the courts, and he had settled into a pattern of resentment and denial that offered no hope for genuine rehabilitation. He had become exactly what his actions had revealed him to be, a person so consumed by greed and ambition that he was incapable of accepting responsibility for the destruction he had caused. But Michael's recovery had been the unexpected bright spot in our family's painful journey toward healing. Now 17 and preparing for college, he had slowly rebuilt a relationship with me that was more honest and meaningful than what we had shared before the crisis. His letters had evolved from confused apologies to thoughtful reflections on ethics, family loyalty, and the courage required to stand up for principles, even when it meant challenging people you loved. The trauma of his parents' imprisonment had forced him to mature quickly, but it had also given him insights into character and integrity that many people never develop. Grandma Susan, he wrote in his most recent letter, "I've been thinking about what I want to study in college, and I keep coming back to research ethics. Not because I want to be a scientist like you, but because I want to understand how good people make terrible choices and how we can create systems that support ethical decision-making, even under pressure." Michael's college application essay, which he had shared with me before submitting it, was a profound meditation on family loyalty, moral courage, and the importance of choosing truth over convenience. He wrote about watching his parents' trial and realizing that real love sometimes required challenging the people you cared about most when they were making destructive choices. "My grandmother taught me that integrity isn't just about following rules," he concluded. "It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you everything. She lost her daughter and nearly lost her life fighting for truth, but she saved her soul and her legacy. That's the kind of person I want to become." Reading Michael's essay filled me with a pride and hope that I hadn't experienced since Clara's early scientific achievements. Despite the trauma he had endured, or perhaps because of it, Michael was developing into someone with the moral clarity and strength of character that would serve him well throughout his life. The quiet evenings in my restored home had become times of deep contentment rather than loneliness. Surrounded by the awards, photographs, and mementos of a career dedicated to ethical scientific research, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from knowing that your life's work has created lasting positive change. The company that bore my name was thriving under principled leadership. My scientific discoveries were helping develop treatments that would benefit humanity for generations, and young researchers around the world were being inspired by the example of someone who had chosen integrity over wealth, truth over comfort. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had ultimately become the foundation for a legacy more meaningful than anything I could have achieved through commercial success alone. I had learned that the greatest victory is not defeating your enemies, but remaining true to your principles, even when everyone you love has abandoned them. At 68 years old, I had finally found the peace that comes from knowing that you have fought the right battles for the right reasons, regardless of the personal cost. My life had been reclaimed not through revenge or bitterness, but through the patient pursuit of truth and the unwavering commitment to the values that define who we truly are. As I write these words in my restored office, surrounded by the fruits of a lifetime dedicated to ethical scientific research, I am struck by the profound peace that has settled over my days. The woman who nearly lost everything to family betrayal and corporate fraud has been transformed into someone whose legacy will endure long after the pain of those dark years has faded. The company that Clara and Greg tried to steal has become more successful than ever, not because we compromised our principles for profit, but because we proved that integrity and innovation can flourish together when guided by genuine commitment to serving humanity. The Davis process continues to help develop life-saving treatments around the world, ensuring that my scientific contributions will benefit countless people I will never meet. The Susan Davis Foundation has become a beacon of hope for young researchers who refuse to choose between career advancement and ethical behavior. Through our mentorship programs and research grants, we are nurturing a generation of scientists who understand that true success comes from using their talents to make the world better, not just to make themselves richer. My journey taught me that the greatest strength lies not in trusting blindly, but in having the courage to confront betrayal when it threatens everything you hold dear. I learned that family bonds, while precious, cannot be preserved through silence when corruption threatens to poison the relationships that matter most. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal costs you everything. The profound lesson I carry from this ordeal is that integrity will ultimately prevail over deception, but only if someone is willing to pay the price required to defend it. Truth is not self-defending. It requires champions who will sacrifice comfort, security, and even family relationships to ensure that lies do not triumph over reality. For those who may face similar betrayals, I offer this counsel: your worth is not determined by other people's recognition or approval. Your legacy is not dependent on family members who have lost their way. Your principles are not negotiable, even when maintaining them seems to cost you everything that matters. I am 70 years old now, and I have learned that the most profound victories are not won on battlefields or in courtrooms, but in the quiet moments when you choose truth over convenience, integrity over wealth, courage over comfort. My story is testament to the resilience of the human spirit and proof that it is never too late to fight for what you believe in. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me became the foundation for a life of greater meaning and authenticity than I had ever known. In losing my daughter, I found my purpose. In defending my legacy, I discovered my strength. In choosing truth over family harmony, I created the possibility for relationships built on honesty rather than comfortable lies. My name is Susan Davis, and I am a scientist, an inventor, a mentor, and a woman who learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is the example of someone who refuses to abandon their principles no matter the cost. The truth set me free, and in that freedom I found peace.